Dobry den to all. It's a privilege to be in Kiev for the first time. And I'm going to talk about the ruins. Reincarnations is the name of the project. And, okay. And it's a way to think about the future of architecture through ruins with a stress on not fetishizing the ruins. And I always try to think about the future and about the future of the architecture especially through critique of the present. So the first point of my presentation would be what is wrong with fascination with ruins today and with fascination with ruins specifically in architecture, and what does this mean for the future of architecture, and how can we use the fascination with decay or the potential of a ruin in another more productive way. And when I say fascination with ruins, I first and foremost think of the visual images that keep popping up on the internet, in photographic galleries, on the destruction that seems to become so appealing in our post-industrial age. At the moment when the production has gone to warmer places, when our towns stopped producing things, which first happened in Western Europe and has moved throughout most of Europe, and the industry has relocated to areas we don't know much about, so it's gone out of our sight. These images, probably you've seen Detroit, the images of Detroit, the industrial city of the 20th century that suddenly pops up in every second internet gallery on the so-called beauty of decay. But I don't mean only post-industrial ruins, I mean also political ruins, and this is an image that's obviously well known for you here. And the visual power of ruins is inherently political as well, not only economic. And I thought it's very interesting that an artist did a painting of the same scene, so Maidan Nezalezhnosti in ruins, as a painting, which reminds me of an 18th century artist that did similar kind of stuff, that tried to capture political potency of architecture through making it ruinous, as if this is the permanent state, without people, just the architecture being destroyed, as this is politically really powerful stuff. And I'm not talking only just about these kind of political or economic ruins, also natural catastrophes. Some kind of imagery of sublime is still alive and well as it was in the 18th century. This is a glaze ice in Slovenia 2 years ago. And the first thing that came up with this natural catastrophe were these images of fascination, how quickly our infrastructure, our everyday structures became crippled, became destroyed by this sublime power of nature. And about futurism, as another member of Future Architecture Platform also nicely pointed out, Anna Jenic, we seem that we have problems thinking futurism as it existed in the 60s and the 70s with these UFO-like structures with futuristic forms. We have problems thinking about them in the other way than as ruins. This is a Budluja monument in Bulgaria that is one of those places that seem to pop up everywhere, together with Detroit, together with some other structures, that every photographer that has a bit of time needs to go and take his or her own picture of it. So something that was ultimately modern and something that in a way encompassed belief in the future of architecture in the 60s and the 70s can now only be visualized as destroyed, as in ruins. But I don't want to make this a very pessimistic view, and nor do I want to say that imagining world in ruins is something new, that's something that is existing only now in our post-industrial age. It's actually something that has existed all the way from the start of political and industrial changes that shook 18th century Europe and later the world. And one of the most powerful images that show this is this figure of New Zealander. It's a person from New Zealand, which was only colonized then for the first time, is depicted in London, or better, in the ruins of London, drawing St. Paul's Cathedral as if he's in Rome, as if he's on one of those grand tours that people made in the 18th century, sketching the ruins of Rome. He's doing the same thing with London in historic time when London was at its peak of its power. So London was ruling a third of the globe. It was the first and most awesome power in military and particularly in economic terms. And yet the Victorian Londoners were fascinated by someone coming in the future from some of very local and faraway colonies and depicting their own very powerful world in form of ruins. And I think that this points that the ruin is something that gains on power, on imagery power, especially in the age of modernity. So when industrial production starts, when political concoctions with the French Revolution and all of the other things become a reality, the ruin becomes a very powerful object, not just a decaying object, not just an object that's not needed by anyone, but an object with immense potential. And one of the earliest quotes, which I will devote a minute or two, shows very well, I think maybe the best of all, is a quote from a letter of Goethe to Schiller at the end of the 18th century. So this is a time of French Revolution, and the French Revolutionary Army has sieged Frankfurt, where Goethe's family had its home. And Goethe is telling to Schiller what happened to his family's home. He says, "My grandfather's house, its courtyard and its gardens had been transformed from the parochial patrician home of an old Frankfurt elder into the most useful trading and marketplace by wisely enterprising people. Curious coincidence during the bombardment conspired to see the structure perish, but even today, reduced for the most part to a pile of rubble, it is still worth twice as much as the current owners paid my family for it 11 years ago. Conceivably, the whole thing may, in the future, be bought and restored by yet another entrepreneur, and you can easily see that it would, in more than one sense, stand as a symbol of thousands of other instances in this industrious city, and in particular in my own eyes." So why I find this quotation so extremely interesting? Because it shows that suddenly the ruined building is perhaps more valuable than a complete one when you have entrepreneurs buying up the distracted areas, when they use them, when they rebuild them, when they make something out of ancient home that Goethe is talking about. He's talking about a building that has been completely destroyed, and yet it has more worth in financial ways than it had before. And this can only be possible in an era which started to build on capitalism, which started to build on industrial production, which started to look on object as something not as existing, but something that has potential. So this is a story about potential. All of these notions about a house that is extremely more valuable destroyed than as a whole is about the supposed potential of a ruin. This is what it makes it so appealing to the entrepreneurs then, but also now. That's why you see so many signs of redeveloping and building, on, particularly in the areas, in industrial areas or former industrial areas, that are least valuable now, but can be most valuable in a short period of time. And I think that extreme allegory of this is the zone in the celebrated film Stalker by Tarkovsky. Because as you know, this zone is an extremely hostile environment. that's deadly to most people. But if you can get a stalker to guide you through and reach the very center of this area, which is deadly all around, then all of your wishes can come true, or your most secret wishes. And this is an allegory of how the ruin is perceived by developers. Something that has no value whatsoever right now, that is the scene of total destruction right now, but has an immense potential somewhere in the future. And I'm interested in how this potential is used by developers and how it is used by the architects, how it is helped by the architects to the developers. And I think it's a very problematic practice. I would like to go shortly through three examples of such architectural entrepreneurship, how architects use ruins to make good investments out of them, but disregard what I would say is a good potential of a ruin, what's a progressive potential of a ruin. So I would say that this is architectural critique part of my talk. And all of these three buildings are in Zurich. They're in a former industrial area of Zurich called Escher Wyss. And all of those were in some way or another industrial objects themselves. The first is this Schiffbau building that used to be a production hall for ships, which has been converted to a theater building. There's nothing strange about that. It's a big hall that's obviously flexible. You can put everything in. But what I found extremely interesting is that, inside it has all of the equipment for the state-of-the-art theater. It's very clean-cut interior, and everything is as it should be. But on the outside, you have many glass panels that are broken. So the building has been renovated, but very, very painstakingly, people who renovated it tried to preserve the feel as if the building is dead, as if it's decayed, as if it still hasn't been reused. And this contrast in between state-of-the-art interior and the exterior that tries to look as it's vacant and decaying, seemed to me that this is not really a revitalization of a building, that is basically squatting a building while pretending that the building is dead. So in a way, I would term it architectural necromancy. It's not a revitalization, it's adverse thing. It's keeping the building dead despite inhabiting it. The other very different example is this building here, which looks like it's just been built. And in a way it has been, but when you come closer you see that all of the structures around it is just a curtain wall around a very old and very impressive industrial hall. And all of the new areas are on top, are the upper stories there. And so when you enter the building, you see that the hall itself has remained completely empty. It's like a church to industrial age that has long passed. The cranes are hanging down as if you just press a button and everything will start to move. So everything is structured very carefully, as if this is still a working factory, but all the commercial areas are built around it, so that they create this sanctified open space, as if you would enter into a church of post-industrial age, as if we are so fascinated by the evacuation of industrial production that this becomes extremely powerful image. And the third one, and perhaps the most interesting one, is the Freitag Tower that you can see here on the right. And this is all in the same area, an area that's been developed really quickly into very expensive commercial premises. And you might know this building, it's built out of containers. And it's a new building. It's not a revitalization. It's not an old ruin. And yet, these containers are all very rusty, worn. They try to communicate as if they've been constantly reused until someone recycled them and put them into this rather impressive structure. But I mean, when you walk around Switzerland, and when you walk around Zurich in particular, you see that even on the construction sites, all the containers, and there is a lot of construction sites in this area still. It's one of the areas of redevelopment. All the containers are immaculately clean. I mean, this is Switzerland. Everything is as if you would enter a laboratory. And even the construction sites are completely clean, well kept. The containers don't have even any writings on them, let alone the rust. And then you see that the construction sites are so well kept, but the final result is trying to communicate a feel of decay so intensely. And you can almost see that after they build it, they engaged people who went around and used special sprays to make it a rusty interior, so to apply a layer of decay on top of it. Or at a huge costs, bought the old containers from somewhere else and transported it to here. Which tells that decay sells really well, better than the new buildings. But I wouldn't like to be only pessimistic. I think there's another way of looking at ruins and another way of using them as architects. Because all of those things we've just seen have been done by architects with a certain agenda in mind. But there are other sorts of architects who use the existing state of things. If we define the ruin as an object that has only the past and the future, so it has something that this object was, and it has that rather dangerous or double-edged potential in the future that makes it so appealing to investors. But it doesn't have a now. It doesn't have, this is a structure without a present. The only structure defined by the lack of present. Well, this was well recognized by Lacaton and Vasal, which I think is still one of the most interesting architectural firms in the world, in this respect at least, with their renovation of this Place Léon Aucoq in Bordeaux, which, as you may know, is a renovation that to most people isn't a renovation at all. They have been commissioned to renovate this square as we see it, and it was meant as a starting point of a mayor who has just been elected, and he wanted to show his people that they elected the right man, and that he will renovate all the decaying urban places in the town. And they went to the square and observed the people there. How did they act? How did they react? How did they use the space? How the space is lived in by the local people. And they didn't find any reason to change anything whatsoever. So the whole architecture project just consisted of the set of rules how to keep this area as it is. To change the pavement, to change the area on the floor, to keep the benches, and that's it. And one could argue that's not even an architectural act, but then again, this passivity of the architect is, I think, something that draws this place, this square, from its past and potential of the future into now. That architectural articulation of the moment of now enters this, and this suddenly becomes recognized as a place with some present value. And they did something similar, I think, with Palais de Tokyo in Paris, which was supposed to be renovated for a huge amount of money into an art center. And they did it with a fraction of that cost. But I don't think that's an architectural innovation here, how much you spend on the building. I think that innovation here is not trying to renovate it in a way that we've seen in Zurich, to carefully keep up the decaying feel of the structure, to carefully recreate this theater of decay in order to make it more consumable, to make the architecture more consumable, but just to curate the relation in between the existing building and a relation with a completely new conflicted use, and see what this productive conflict creates. And it works rather well. So I think this is something that I would term a progressive potential of the ruin. And progressive potential of the ruin would, shortly speaking, would be exactly eliminate potential. To eliminate any kind of notions of future potential of a building is to force it into today, is to force it to be inhabited by today's people, for today's uses. And I've been involved in some of the workshops, and I've done some research work on my own behalf in these kind of structures that I think have immense potential to erase the potential out of them. And this is a huge construction site. It's partly construction site, partly a ruin. They're very similar, these two. Just from they just go from the other angles, but they seem very similar. This is in Ljubljana, in my hometown, a gigantic construction site that was stopped because of the recession. And a workshop by the same architects who did this was commenced on how to use this building with the present state in mind. So how not to finish it, how not to complete it as it was meant for some other times and for some other needs before the financial crisis, but how to just use it as it is, see what's there that couldn't be used if it would be finished and made in a gigantic shopping mall. How to use it sustainably? That's the interesting question here. And a rather, maybe even more extreme example of this gigantic ruin / construction site, again, in Montenegro, which is both things at once. Again, it's a ruin because it has been decaying for 30 years, and it's a construction site because it never has been finished, and it's a revolution home. So obviously now even the revolution has moved on, and you can't find it in Montenegro anymore. So this is a house without a program, without being finished, and decaying at the same time. There has been a very interesting competition just recently, where I've been one of the jurors, that showed this problem of architects, how to think of the unfinished buildings, how to think of buildings that are not completed in architecture way, how to take your hands off the project at the right moment in order not to complete everything. I mean, you can say a building is finished, but that also has a double meaning, in English at least, right? If you're finished, you're dead. So, I mean, it would be interesting to finish a building before it's literally finished. I think that has something to do with the way that Lacaton and Vasal are doing with their projects as well. And these few days has been my first time to Kiev, so I've just gone around the town rather quickly, but I've been to Podol area and near the industrial area, near the harbor, where some of the points that I tried to show maybe seem quite, maybe you can observe them quite well in this respect. Obviously there are unfinished construction sites, but you have this strange link in between the existing ruin and appetites for the developments. I mean, they go hand in hand, as I tried to illustrate before. The building that's most destroyed is the building with the biggest supposed potential. It's something that I think it's rather uncanny, and that it should be a matter of critique by the architects, in order that the architects wouldn't be just accomplices to the current supposed needs or current building of the potentials in the eyes of the investors, but they would rather be more of a urban whistleblowers, if you wish, that they would try to articulate something rather more interesting than trying to preserve this decay, which I think is rather nihilistic, that they would try to curate the existing state of buildings with existing uses and then stand off a little bit and see what this creates, and perhaps enjoying this urban productive conflict, as I would define it. I thank you for your attention, and if anyone has any questions, I would be glad to answer it.
Піднімайте руку, я до вас підходжу з мікрофоном. Питання ви можете задати на українській чи російській мові, якщо вам так зручніше.
Добрый день, спасибо большое за лекцию. У нас это очень часто встречается проблема недостроенных и брошенных зданий. Ну, как бы уточнить главную идею того, что вот заброшенные и недостроенные здания, мы можем их оставить в покое и как бы посмотреть, как они ведут себя, и это может принести более успешные результаты. И вопрос, как бы, они, вот эти недострои и заброшенные здания, влекут за собой определенные социальные процессы, то есть у нас как бы вот как с этим поступать, или это все-таки остаются вот у нас часто они привлекают какие-то социально неблагополучные, можем сказать, группы, и как вот в вашей практике с этим, ну, пытаются решить эти проблемы, или это не проблема вообще, что как бы делать?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think it tackles one thing that maybe I didn't have time to go in, and that's what it makes it extremely interesting to answer this. I think that the ruin, outside of this developers potential that I've been talking about, it can only exist as an outsider. So, I mean, in a society, the ruins are always outside of a everyday normal life. So that makes it a perfect object for inhabiting, for people that are also considered outsiders to live in ruins. Both people that are outsiders and buildings that are outsiders come in a way naturally together. Well, that's a way to look at it, but I think that the progressive way is to try to use supposedly the ruins for everyday mainstream functions. So that this shouldn't be a technique for housing alternatives or for housing outsiders only, but also for very, very mainstream acts. In a way, I see it as a mainstreamization of the ruin would destroy the notion of the ruin itself. If you don't think of an object as garbage, as a result of a process, as just a waste process, and if you live in it, like people live in developing countries, the notion of a ruin disappears. I'm not saying that means that we would all need to live in squalor or in distracted areas. I just think that architects, as well as the power relations in general in society, shouldn't acknowledge the notion of waste. So to live in waste basically means to discard with the notion of waste. The ruin would cease to exist if the mainstream functions would start to inhabiting it. And I think that we should approach this not with carefully preserving the building necessarily as it is, but just using its layout, using the way it is present in space, to use it as a starting point, with an architect being just a curator, to use the existing point of things and to use existing functions and then creating this productive conflict. I think the danger of using the decaying spaces or spaces that are ruins for alternative functions means that they just coexist in a very comfortable relation to the mainstream. A ruin is not problematic for the mainstream if it defines itself as being as an outsider. It's very problematic for the mainstream if it comes to the mainstream itself. I hope I answered a little bit.
Можливо, ще в когось є питання?
В общем, для Украины, как и, по сути, для всех государств, которые раньше входили в Советский Союз, и как бы постиндустриальная эпоха очень как бы близка. Возникали огромные города, которые начинали свою жизнь с индустрии. Сейчас таких городов очень много, и они как бы наполнены такими промышленными руинами. Все больше в мире появляется тенденций о как бы происхождении четвертой промышленной революции, которая бы, возможно, провела, так сказать, дала вторую жизнь этим зданиям. Как вы как бы видите эту реновацию? Вы видите это изменение, например, в сквоты, FabLab, TechShop или какие-то другие производственные центры? Как, в общем, это может быть в будущем?
Thank you for the question. I think for me it was extremely interesting to go through these areas of Kyiv I showed before, because I think it's an interesting mix of revitalization or gentrification of certain areas together with still having production in them. So they're in the middle of change. I think that what I would term a progressive use of these industrial ruins is actually a way to be able to live with one's own history. Not of discarding history every 20 years, like we do in Slovenia as well, and starting from a clean plate, but basically acknowledging that this very strong industrial heritage, that's not only heritage, I mean, but it has been an extremely important part of both architecture, but also society as a whole, and living in its remains, I think makes a more healthy, a more progressive way of seeing it, of living with one's own past, than just creating, hipster zones with a little bit of shabby chic places. So I would say that there are two main ways that you can use the industrial heritage or industrial houses. One is to fetishize them, and the other is to live with them, in them, but still in a way in this creative conflict that they necessarily make, because they were built for different times and for different needs. But that's completely okay. In castles, for instance, are objects that have been built for a very, very, very different ways than we live now, and many of them are still inhabited. And that just makes the way you need to use a building a lot more interesting and a lot less predefined, a lot less functionalist, if you wish, a lot more emancipatory, both for the user and for the architecture in question. I hope I answered a little bit of your question.